Welcome to Signal AI. So I'm Dan. I work here at Signal in this office, and we're going to be talking about getting events from the news. This is going to be quite a quick, informal slap-up talk. It should take around 10 or 15 minutes. It's not going to be super scientific, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. And it's about getting events from the news. So if you don't know Signal AI, I guess we've got a database of about 1 billion news articles in there, which is really useful, but it's also kind of useless unless you allow people to get the right news and not the wrong news and understand it quickly. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how we've been clustering news into what we call events. So how do we group similar news stories together into groups to allow people to search for it better and understand what's been happening? So I'm going to show you some of our results where we've been doing this. And also why we do it and what the use case is. And I'll show you a little bit how we didn't make it work. And then how we kind of, by using less formal and more kind of practical techniques, we had more success in some of the lessons we've learned there. So without further ado, so I want to imagine if you've got, we've got about 15 months of news data. And I want to imagine if you're trying to ask our database what happened in the last 15 months, how would you answer that question? And it's a kind of interesting question to ask because there aren't really any search terms. If someone doesn't know what's happened, they can't ask you what they want. So the way we've been approaching this is to cluster stories together and rank them by the size of those clusters. So if you do that kind of our system, you get a result a little bit like this. And I wouldn't trust these numbers exactly and take them at face value, but it shows you quite a promising way of explaining a large data set and giving a flavor of what happens. So if you look at our clusters, you'll see big clusters around the assassination of Shinzo Abe, death of Queen Elizabeth. The third biggest one was Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. There was a Facebook and Instagram outage where everyone completely flipped out for a day and wrote loads of news stories about that. So hopefully you can see that by clustering news stories together into groups and looking at the size of those groups, it can be quite a potentially useful or powerful way of taking these large data sets and making them more approachable, easier to explore, and easier to understand. And that's what we've been doing. So this is kind of a contrived example. No one wants to know that, the Queen died. We all know that. But there's more practical ways we can use this kind of technology as well. So imagine if we want to know what's been going on at Pfizer, say this year. If we cluster the stories about Pfizer, it becomes much easier to understand and get a narrative around the company. So in our system, we've got about 1 million articles about Pfizer. So it's a very large number. And most of them, to be honest with you, are quite boring. And they're about their share price changing by 0.5% each day and doing kind of stuff that you expect drug companies to do, like make drugs and things like that. But if you start clustering the stories together, you get a much better and quick sense of what's been happening. So you see at the start of the year, they started testing their Omicron vaccine. Their pill, I think, was approved. They started seeking approval for vaccinating children for COVID. Around May, they offered to release some of their medicines at cost to poor countries. They announced their earnings, which are very positive. And in August, they were sued by Moderna. So you quickly get quite a fast sense there of what's been happening with Pfizer. And what we want to do is enable people to get that info just within a few seconds rather than having to trudge through potentially thousands of articles. And by just ordering stories by date or by relevance to Pfizer, you don't really get this picture, this narrative. And it's nothing, you can't use a single document to describe this. Equally, if you don't know that Pfizer has offered medicines to poor countries, how would you search for that if you don't know that it's happened? What would you input to the system to get that information? So by clustering, we think we can help uncover things that people might not know already and uncover things. So we think this could be useful, for example, for auditors. If you're looking to do business in the pharma industry, or maybe you're looking to sign up a contract with a company, often you just need to understand just generally what's been happening, what do I know about and what don't I know about. So that's kind of the what we have right now and the kind of results we get. And I want to move on to how we got here. And the way we started was kind of the way probably maybe a lot of people would start, which is just trying to shove this all into various Python clustering algorithms and hope for the best. But this is really difficult because firstly, you might have experienced often clustering algorithms don't really agree with you or your customers about what a cluster ought to be and what isn't a cluster. And you can get very abstract groupings that don't really correspond to business logic. It was really hard to align it with what users expected. It was really hard to get the clustering to focus on what was important and what was less important, and to help to try and get it to treat kind of big companies, small companies with equal weighting and form reasonable clusters. So in the end, we kind of just threw out clustering and we decided to just reinvent the wheel, but just try something different and have a go at our own weird version of clustering, basically. So this is kind of how we approached it. And it was all around exploiting time dependence and how the news changes. Because the news isn't just text, it's something that's changing over time. And the way it changes is actually one of the most interesting and prominent features in the news. So before I kind of continue, I just want to tell you a little bit about what Signal is and what our data looks like, just so this all makes sense. So this is almost insulting the oversimplification of Signal, so I apologize to all my colleagues, but you can kind of imagine Signal as we've got this big archive of news stories, and you can imagine they've got things like identifiers and dates and headlines and text and things like that. And we collect all these news stories from various providers all over the world. And then what we do is we try and enrich that news with extra data. So we do things like if a news story mentions Cadbury's, we will tag that on that story using our classifiers so that we can associate a particular news story with a company. And equally, we tag our news stories with topics like food and drinks industry or supply chains or indeed litigation and things like that. And that's how we enrich the news and part of the way that we try and make it more accessible and the data more useful. And we've got, like I say, about 1 billion of these news stories all like this. And if you're interested, we've got lots of other stuff as well that I won't talk about here, but if you find some from Signal later, I'm sure they're happy to tell, they can tell you about all the other wonderful things we do to enrich news. And basically, the news looks like this, in my view. So whenever something happens in the news, you get this kind of pattern. So what we've got here is a plot over time of how many stories about Pfizer, also about litigation. So you can see normally what you get is you'll have some background level where a tiny number of stories at random or by chance will mention Pfizer and litigation. And then when something happens, like a lawsuit, you'll get a big spike and it'll go back down again really quickly. And this is one of the most dramatic features you see in our news data, and it's just omnipresent and you see it everywhere. And the news is just inherently very, very spiky. And we want to try and use this information to help us make better systems. So it kind of makes sense that the news looks like this because this is how the news works. If something interesting happens, loads of journalists are racing to be the first ones to talk about it and get it out of the press first. And if it's interesting, lots of other journalists will write about it too. And if it's not interesting, they won't. Equally, as soon as people have read it, people don't really talk about it very much afterwards. It's yesterday's news. No one's going to come to your website or buy your newspaper to read yesterday's news. They did that yesterday. So not only does kind of stuff enter the news really, really quick, it also exits the news really fast as well. Maybe people talk about it for longer, or it's mentioned in passing or down the page, but it rarely stays as headline news very long, apart from maybe a few kind of freakish things that happen every so often. But even then, I think you'll be surprised. So what we started doing with Signal is we look for this shape, this key shape in all of our data and to try and pick out these spikes. And the other nice thing about these spikes is that if you're at the peak of that spike, you can kind of approximate that all these stories are talking about the same big event that just happened, apart from maybe a few odd ones that you'd associate with that background level. So we switched from clustering to really just detecting spikes, and they're all roughly about the same thing. And we can just take that group of documents, that set of documents, and we can encode it into a vector or something like that, or in some kind of representation. It's just a bunch of documents. it's also quite a rich representation, because now we've got a lot of documents all talking about the same thing. Our term frequencies are very good. We've got a lot of signal to noise as well. And actually, when you look at these features, often you can almost tell what's happened in the news just by looking at the features and which ones are strong. So this already gets us quite a long way to clustering news. The other thing we do is a lot of news is just not interesting, so we ignore it, and it's a pretty vicious approximation, but we kind of have to do this to make it achievable. So we only take news stories and put them down into our clustering pipeline if there's some interesting spike like this. If Pfizer gets mentioned with pharmacy or Ford gets mentioned with automobiles, that's not interesting. You only look for these spikes where things are out of the ordinary to try and make this more tractable and reduce the data down. So already we've got much less data, and we go down from about 1 billion news stories a day to about 150,000 spikes a day instead. So we'll have all of these spikes now, and each one will be a group of documents. Maybe there'll be Pfizer and litigation, but also they'll probably be saying like Moderna and litigation if Pfizer suing Moderna. So we want to group these things together.
How do you generate these pairs? How do you know which one are the pairs you can try possible combinations?
Oh, we can.
Okay.
I mean, there's things you can do to do that efficiently, but we do it every day, and it costs us $3 or $4. And you might see other spikes that have got nothing to do with lawsuits. Like that day, T-Mobile and space exploration was another spike. It's something different. So we take these spikes, and to cut a long story short, we cluster the spikes instead of individual news articles. And it turns out this works surprisingly well, and it becomes a much easier, more tractable problem. So, and in the end, we can group, instead of having documents, we can now have a data structure that represents a group of documents. So we have an event, as we call it. It might have a date, it might have accounts for a number of stories. It might have a bunch of headlines now. We say, well, Pfizer and Moderna are mentioned in 99% of these documents. So it's about them and health and patents, whatever. And we can take these groupings instead, and we can put them into Elasticsearch and make them available to search as groups of documents rather than individual documents. So to come back to your question, like how do we check all these pairs? So we have all these articles in S3, and one of my favorite tools out there, which I really, really recommend to you, is called Amazon Athena. And it lets you kind of manipulate your files in S3 using SQL, and it uses Apache Presto behind the hood, which is a kind of like a big data column-based database. And these spikes are pretty obvious. You don't have to do anything very clever to pick them out, and it's reasonably easy and efficient to do with a tool like Amazon Athena or Presto or something like that. And most pairs are never mentioned together at all, so it's trivial. So it's not, the number is not as large as you think. Then we cluster it, so we just, each day we treat separately. We submit them to AWS Batch via Metaflow, which is another tool that we really love here. And then we write that into Elasticsearch and make it available to query. So that's my really quick version of how we do clustering at scale and our events clustering. And I guess the conclusions, what I'd say is probably, if you're stuck or if you're just banging your head against algorithms, maybe step back, start simple, look at your data, understand what's happening there, and use that to guide you. And sometimes a practical solution like this, even if it's not rigorous, can still actually produce a lot of value for your users and still be useful. And then the other thing I'd say is often a lot of online data sets, they might not have things like timestamps, and actually these kind of open source data sets sometimes don't actually reflect the reality of everything available in the real data set. So that's the end. And yeah, thank you again for listening, and thank you for joining us at Signal today and visiting us here.